Díomh, Edward is sanamdom, is seo an lervas bogloa. Agus seo iad na fuisca gwelga is far do hosahori. Let's go. Alright, welcome to the Rock Gut Review. Don't worry, I'm not going to try to do this whole video in Irish. My Irish is not that good. And as my great Aunt Helene would tell people when she would introduce me to them, I'm not even that Irish. But today we are talking about Irish whiskey, a lovely, wonderful, historical beverage that at one time was the most popular spirit in the entire world. In fact, the very first whiskey ever distilled was most likely made in Ireland. The name whiskey is an anglicization of the words Ishkabaha, which in Irish means water of life. Gaelic monks were actually the first people to make whiskey. They had discovered distillation when they were traveling through Europe and brought it back with them to Ireland. At the time in medieval Europe, a lot of different countries were making aquavitae, which again just means water of life. They were using whatever local ingredients they had and were making it for medicinal purposes. Of course, most of that distillation was probably from grapes rather than from grain, since they were more plentiful in parts of mainland Europe. However, the Irish monks decided, hey, we don't have a lot of grapes, why don't we do it with beer? And so the first whiskey came to be. Now, there are some people who like to argue that whiskey actually started in Scotland, not in Ireland. However, it kind of doesn't matter, because neither Ireland nor Scotland, in their form as modern nation-states, existed at this time. Basically, there were just a bunch of Gaelic kingdoms at this time with a lot of different flow and immigration between them. So whether it started in modern Ireland or modern Scotland doesn't really matter, because it was shared so quickly between them anyway. Doesn't really make a difference. I mean, not that it matters, but the first written record of whiskey in Ireland comes from 1405, and the first written record of whiskey in Scotland doesn't show up till 1494. Just saying. But of course, Irish whiskey back then was not the golden-hued and sweet little dram that we love today. It was more like, this. This is poitín, which is essentially Irish moonshine. And I'm sure you can see there's absolutely no color there, because the original whiskeys weren't being aged. Those early whiskeys were basically just super strong, fiery white lightning. It wasn't actually until hundreds of years later that barrel aging became standard for pretty much all whiskeys. Now, Irish whiskey was the most popular spirit in the world up until the late 19th century. A big part of the reason that it faded from the global consciousness is blended Scotch. If you haven't seen my previous video, a blended Scotch is made out of grain whiskey, made in a column still, and malt whiskey, made in a pot still. Most Irish distillers refused to make grain whiskey. They didn't think it was actually whiskey. Using a pot still takes a lot more time. You have to do it batch by batch, and generally you retain some richer flavors. So the Irish said, no, we're not doing column still. And the Scottish said, oh, we're on top of that. And blended Scotch started taking over the market. People loved it. It wasn't as rich and powerful because of the grain whiskey. It was a little more easygoing. It was smoother. Which is ironic given how much people hate it today and talk about single malt all the time. And now these changes in the market also came at a pretty lousy time for the Irish, because right around the same time, the struggle for independence from Britain was heating up. The Irish War for Independence and the Irish Civil War that followed in the early 1920s were both highly disruptive to the whiskey industry. But maybe even a bigger problem, they led to a trade war with Great Britain. Great Britain had been buying tons and tons of Irish whiskey, and suddenly they weren't gonna do it anymore. So where were the Irish gonna sell their booze? Well, to Americans, of course, except they couldn't, because of Prohibition. Boo! Boo prohibition! And suddenly, the market for Irish whiskey was gone. In the 1890s, there were 28 distilleries in Ireland. By 1972, there were only 2, both of whom were owned by one company, Irish Distillers. Damn, that's pretty depressing, right? Well, don't worry, because if the Irish are good at one thing, it's bouncing back. And also emigrating. Really good at that. The Whiskey Boob has brought Irish whiskey back in force. As of this moment, there are 32 distilleries on the island, with another 19 on the way. So this is a fantastic time to be getting into Irish whiskey. But where should one start? Well, I have a few suggestions for you. Now, I've tried to choose whiskeys that are readily available, that are easy drinking for people who are just getting started, and are good values. And honestly, the biggest problem I had with making this list was trimming it down. There were so many whiskeys I wanted to include because there's so many good Irish whiskeys, and they're excellent for beginners. Irish whiskey overall generally represents kind of a middle path between bourbon and Scotch. Scotch tends to be a lot more smoky and heavy, generally, and bourbon tends to be a lot more sweet and woody. So Irish whiskey tries not to be cloyingly sweet, but just sweet enough, and generally isn't so smoky and heavy that you're gonna find it hard to drink. Although now there are a lot of exceptions to that rule because, like this guy here, the Irish are coming back with peat in a big way. Now, under the umbrella of Irish whiskey, there are 3 specific varieties and one that you can make by blending those 3. The first kind is single malt. Much like its Scotch counterpart, this is all malted barley distilled in a pot still, and the single means one distillery. The second kind is the hated grain whiskey. Ooh, boo, boo. No, I actually like grain whiskey. But yes, the Irish eventually did adopt the column still and start making grain whiskey themselves. So these are grains other than malted barley, along with some malted barley distilled in a column still. And the third Irish variety is the one that spurred Ireland to heights of whiskey greatness. And it's actually unique to Ireland. And that's single pot still whiskey. Now, as the name suggests, much like single malt, this whiskey is made in a pot still. However, the difference between this and single malt is the addition of other unmalted grains. A lot of times you'll hear people say, well, pot still whiskey is just malted barley and unmalted barley put together. And that's partially true. Back in 1785, the English government said, hey, we're going to start taxing all your malted barley. And the Irish said, fuck you, we're just going to start distilling unmalted barley. However, historically, they were also using rye and oats and other unmalted grains in these mash bills. The idea that it was only unmalted barley is kind of a modern fiction created by Middleton and Pernod Ricard because that's the way they make pot still whiskey. And those bastards just basically leaned on the Irish government to say, oh, well, that's the only way to make pot still whiskey. I hate you, Pernod Ricard. And if you take any of those 3 and blend them with one of the others, you get blended Irish whiskey. So unlike in Scotland, where blended Scotch has to have grain whiskey, blended Irish doesn't actually have to have any grain whiskey in it. Because we hate you, grain whiskey. But let's start with some basics. So first of all, if you are absolutely completely new to whiskey, you have never had whiskey ever before, and you're worried it's gonna kick you, you're not gonna like it, try Two Gingers. Two Gingers is not a particularly complex whiskey. It tastes like caramel, vanilla, pretty much that's it. But that's not a bad thing if you are just a complete newbie. It's a really easygoing whiskey, and it mixes well. You know, you can put it in Coke, coffee, ginger ale, whatever you want to do. Also, it's dirt cheap. Can't beat that. Now, if you want to take a step up from the Two Gingers into stuff that has a little bit more flavor, you can definitely go with the blended Irish whiskeys. And I know a lot of people don't like blended whiskey, people who are a little bit more advanced in their journey. But again, there's nothing wrong with blended whiskey at all. And you know what? I think the Irish do blended whiskey, and actually low proof blended whiskey, 40%ers, better than pretty much any other country. Of course, most people start with Jameson. It's the biggest Irish brand, right? Or you might start with something like Tullamore Dew. Also, not a bad option. You got stuff like McConnell's from Great Northern. You've got Slane. You've got Teeling Small Batch. Actually, what I'm drinking right now. And of course, you've got stuff like Jameson Black Barrel and Bushmills Black Bush. All of these are pretty easygoing. They're vanilla, they're caramel, they got a little bit of wood. The main differences in flavor come from what they were aged in. Teeling has a little bit more of that bittersweet taste because it was finished in rum barrels. Jameson Black Barrel and Slane have a little bit more of that punchy woodiness, although Slane also has a sherry element, as does Bushmills Black Bush. There's a heavy sherry element in there if you like dried fruits. And McConnell's, well, that's just straight up easygoing Irish whiskey. Vanilla, caramel, honey, butter, nothing wrong with that. But I know you didn't just come here to hear about blended whiskey. You've had Jameson and Tullamore Dew. You know a little bit about blended whiskey. Okay. Let's talk the fun stuff. The single malt and single pot still. For single malts, there are two that spring to mind. Bushmills 10 and Napog 12. Both of these are relatively cheap. Both of them are excellent in terms of flavor. Now, personally, I don't think you can go wrong with either of these. I do think the Napog is a little bit more caramely, it's a little bit more buttery, and the Bushmills might have a little bit more punch. But they're both excellent. They're still pretty easygoing, but they've got a little bit more complexity, a little bit more of the fruit, a little bit more honey, a touch more of that malty goodness. But what about the pride and joy of Ireland, single pot still whiskey? Well, I promised someone that I wouldn't recommend Redbreast on this video. So I'm not recommending Redbreast, but I still really like it. But my official recommendations are Powers 3 Swallows, don't laugh at the name, and Green Spot. Both of these are excellent single pot still whiskeys. You still get some of that butterscotchy malted milk ball, but especially with the Powers, that's backed up with just a little bit of a spicy bristle from that green or unmalted barley. And the Green Spot is lovely because it has all this cool fruit. I get coconut and lemon cookies from this, mixed in with a little bit of spice and a lot of caramel. Plus, both of these are relatively inexpensive for pot still whiskey. So if you're looking to get into the true native spirit of Ireland, these are good places to start. But those are my Irish whiskeys for beginners. This is by no means a comprehensive list though. So if you have suggestions for good whiskeys for beginners, please leave them down below. And of course, I would appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel, because next week we're doing the best rye whiskeys for beginners, and I am super pumped for that. But until next time, thank you so much for watching. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay rotten. Sláinte mhath.